In this presentation, we will take a look at multiple choice questions related to governmental accounting, going through those questions and then practicing test-taking skills with them. First question, an inflow of resources according to GASB, G-A-S-B, is either A, expenditures, B, revenues, C, assets, D, deferred inflows. Let's go through this again using the process of elimination. An inflow of resources according to GASB is either A, expenditures. So expenditures sounds like expenses, and expenses you would think would be some kind of outflow, not an inflow, so that doesn't sound reasonable really. And then B says revenues, which you would think kind of would be some type of inflow possibly, so revenue sounds more appropriate. C says assets. Assets is going to be something on the balance sheet. It doesn't seem like a flow type of activity. It's a point in time type of activity. And then D says deferred inflows, which indicates an inflow at least. So that sounds somewhat reasonable. Let's leave it with B and D one more time. An inflow of resources according to GASB is going to be between revenue and deferred inflows. B, revenues. Next question. Information that is essential and useful to placing information in the correct context is reported in either A, financial statements, B, supplementary information, D or C, notes to financial statements, and D, required supplementary information. Let's go through this again using the process of elimination. Information that is essential and useful to placing information in the correct context is reported in either A, financial statements. Now this sounds like added information, not just the financial statement, so I don't think it's going to be A. B says supplementary information. This sounds like a description of some type of supplementary information, so I'll keep B. C says notes to the financial statements. And that could sound somewhat reasonable as well, so if we're talking about information that is essential. And then D says required supplementary information, which again, similar term to B here. So if we now think about this between B, C, and D, I think B and D are somewhat related, and therefore I would eliminate C and say if I didn't really know, I'm going to go between B and D. And then of those two, the D is going to be the most correct answer, the correct answer, because it's the required supplemental information. Final answer, information that is essential and useful to placing information in the correct context is reported in D, required supplemental information. And of course, the key term here, it's going to be essential type of information, therefore required. Next question. Not a characteristic of a fund per GASB. Either A, an accounting entity, B, a fiscal entity, C, a separate legal entity, or D, a self-balancing set of books. Let's go through this again using the process of elimination. Not a characteristic of a fund per GASB. So what is a fund? How could we characterize what a fund is? One, it's got A, an accounting entity. So that sounds like we are doing separate type of accounting for kind of an entity. The term entity would give some kind of indication that it's in and of itself in some way. B says a fiscal entity. And again, that sounds kind of reasonable. It's a separate type of entity, so I'll keep that one here. C says a separate legal entity. And that's the term we typically see with a C corporation or something like that, where it's going to have its own legal entity. And then D says self-balancing set of books. So note that A, an accounting entity, and a self-balancing set of books seem to be somewhat related. They seem kind of similar types of things. If we have a separate accounting entity, we can basically do the books for them, and we can have a balancing set of books. So those are going to be characteristics we would think of. B and C, I would think that C is the most unlike, that would be most likely not to be a characteristic. Why? Because it's similar to if we had a sole proprietor versus a C corporation. We still count the sole proprietor business separate from the owner and count it as its own set of books separately, but we don't call it a separate legal entity, which means we would allocate kind of rights to it that a person would typically have, and so it might not be the same term in terms of C, a separate legal entity. I think B would be appropriate, a fiscal entity. So we'll keep C as the final answer. Not a characteristic of a fund per GASB. C, a separate legal entity.